The G7 is meeting on Tuesday to decide a strategy on Afghanistan 9 days after the fall of the Afghan government. Is it too late and too little given the West's earlier failures in Afghanistan and as the origins tracing of the novel coronavirus continues to make news? I talked to a renowned Belgian virologist to get his view on the subject and how to keep our sanity during this difficult and confusing time. Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Luciano. 9 long days after the Taliban took back Kabul, followed by chaos and panic, the G7 is meeting on Tuesday to weigh in. Ahead of the meeting, reports say Britain will press for sanctions against the Taliban and ask the US to keep its troops in Kabul longer. The Taliban have already reacted, saying they would regard it as further occupation of Afghanistan. Can the group of developed nations, 2 of whom have direct historical responsibility for the situation in the country, be able to reach consensus on viable future steps? I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Hailin, Vice Dean of the National Institute of International Strategy at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and from Doha by Luciano Zaccara, Assistant Professor of Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Professor Ye, let me go to you first. How do you regard the timing of the G7 meeting? Some critics are saying since the last G7 summit held in February 2020, they should have had a plan. Months earlier, ready by now. Is this meeting too late, too little by now?
I think so. It's actually the G7 should need take some decision much earlier than what they already done. When the President Biden make the decision to completely withdraw the troops from Afghanistan, the G7 need to prepare for something. But actually, I think it's a big surprise for all the members of the G7 that the Taliban take the power so quick. So it's obviously the G7 want to make up something, but I don't think now is a good time for G7 or any other country. Any other country inside the region or outside the region can do any actual contribution to the current situation.
Okay, let me go to Professor Zaccara for your take, Professor Zaccara, of the timing and the possible effectiveness of such a discussion on the future development of the situation.
Well, actually, this should have been discussed much earlier. I mean, there was no good planning in this sense. It is true that nobody expected that. It is true that everybody in the whole world was surprised with the speediness in which the Taliban occupied the whole country. But I mean, the countries, the G7 countries should have been prepared for this situation in advance. Whether it was chaotic or not, or fast or not, United States had already decided to pull out from Afghanistan since Trump administration, and Biden just implemented that decision, and they made a decision based on the negotiations that they conducted here in Doha with the Taliban. So they knew that at the end of August, all the American troops would be outside the country. Having a meeting or planning a meeting after that deadline or very close to that deadline is kind of not very useful at this point, moreover having in mind what we are witnessing here. On the other hand,
but it's yeah, Professor Zaccara,
yes.
Sorry for interrupting, but it's very interesting because do you think it is a failure on the part of them to not foresee the situation earlier, or that they didn't think it was important enough to merit such a discussion? Exactly what went wrong? Why didn't they coordinate much earlier?
I think that this is the whole point. Since Biden decided to follow up with the decision taken by Trump, it demonstrated that there is a consensus within the American establishment that it was not useful anymore to remain in Afghanistan, regardless of what happened 20 years ago, regardless of all the effort that the United States spent and money they spent in Afghanistan. They decided there was not a vital interest for the United States in Afghanistan. So once the United States decided that there is no need to be in Afghanistan and that they need to pull out in the most honorable way possible, there was no push for such a meeting to discuss the outcomes or the consequences of the withdrawal, because they expected, nobody expected that the Afghan government would fall so quickly. So I think that this is part of the whole issue.
Yeah. Mr. Ye, what is the biggest lesson you think the G7 and other countries should be able to draw by now as to, for foreign countries, for outside players, what would work and what would not work in Afghanistan?
I think the biggest lesson is that every nation, every country has their own destiny. No any foreigners can make any decisions for the other countries, just like what America did in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. They want to so-called have national rebuilding, but actually just like the President Biden already admit that the nation building is never is the target of the United States. So point is that a couple of years before, the United States make the decision and make the commitment that they want to have the nation building in Afghanistan, but actually in the reality, America never follow such kind of a strategy, and also such kind of a propaganda tactics make a wrong impression of all the international world and also the people in Afghanistan. So now it's leave the only mess. So try to respect the tradition of the Afghanistan and try to respect the reality of this region. That's a very important lesson.
Now, in terms of what to do next, for instance, cleaning up or dealing with the mess that we have seen so far, and possibly, there are talks of sanctions on the Taliban. Mr. Ye, do you think this lesson that you just mentioned have really been drawn and people really have that clear in their mind that, when you're dealing with the future government of Afghanistan, they will have to take a different approach?
Currently, the two major decisions have been discussed by the G7 before the summit. One is the imposed sanction towards the Taliban, and another one is try to extend the military presence in Kabul airport. What ironic, leave some troops in Kabul airport doesn't mean anything, couldn't solve any problem, and impose the sanction towards a country so poor like Afghanistan. I really doubt is any useful information can release to Afghan people and to Taliban. Currently, the international community need to provide assistance to the people in Afghanistan, but not jeopardize their domestic process, and try to make some positive, release some positive signal. But the imposed sanction to Taliban, it definitely is very negative.
Mr. Zaccara, Professor Zaccara, what is your understanding of the possible items that will be discussed in the G7 meeting, and how viable would it be in terms of helping the situation on the ground?
Well, I mean, I'm not very optimistic after 20 years of international coalition intervention in Afghanistan that they pull out in this way. I mean, I don't see how this can be changed. The situation can be changed from outside. It's true. I mean, they can impose some sanctions, but I don't see the actual base of those sanctions. The sanctions that they were imposed in the 90s or in the 2000s were related to maybe international behavior or allowing other groups like Al Qaeda to stay in Afghanistan and to promote terrorism beyond Afghan borders. Now it seems that the situation is a little bit different, that the Taliban are not trying to engage in with other neighbors or other countries in a violent way. Actually, they are trying to have a good relations with most of the neighboring countries, trying to prevent isolationism from the Afghan new regime. So it would be difficult to impose sanctions based on what is going on inside Afghanistan. And moreover, having in mind that the occupation of Kabul was bloodless, there was no military occupation of Afghanistan, on which base sanctions can be exerted. I mean, we listened today that the fuel exports from Iran to Afghanistan that they were suspended since last week, they resumed now. So it's difficult to understand how the international community can now implement similar actions with a similar base that were taken in 20 years ago when they already decided to leave the country and they abandoned militarily the whole country.
Yeah. In terms of China's position, and we know that China has been saying that it's going to respect the will and the choice of the Afghan people. So, Mr. Ye, in terms of what to do next, is there a major difference between what China believes and the G7, any G7 consensus that might come out?
Of course, it's a very big difference between the G7's attitude and the Chinese. For the Chinese government, that we should realize that although the war in Afghanistan is almost accomplished, but the national reconciliation process is still on the way. So the Chinese policy is that we encourage the Afghan, all the forces, political forces, military forces, except the Al Qaeda and ISIL, and all the local political forces can sit on the table and reach a consensus to solve their own problem. And China is ready to provide assistance, but we should notice that without any condition. We don't want to jeopardize their domestic process. We don't want to play a so-called mediator. We just want to provide what they need, but not what we want.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Zaccara, what is your prediction of any different directions, for instance, countries such as China or Russia or India or G7 might be working towards? Keep it short, please.
I mean, as my colleague said, I think that the most important priority now is to provide help to assistance to the people rather than taking measures that they are trying to isolate the Taliban government, whether we like it or not. It's a new government. We need to wait until to see how they behave internationally and how they behave internally. Unfortunately, internally there are many less things that can be done apart from providing assistance to the people.
Many thanks to Hailin from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and Professor Luciano Zaccara from Qatar University.